Election night, November 8th, 1904. President Theodore Roosevelt eats dinner with his family, awaiting results. It had been a rough campaign. Conservatives in his party had planned to oust Roosevelt, this unelected radical, at the convention, and only failed because their candidate died. Plus, with it considered unseemly to campaign while in office, because that used to be a thing, Roosevelt had to leave speeches and rallies to surrogates like William Howard Taft. Meanwhile, his Democratic opponent, Alton Parker, painted Roosevelt as erratic and owned by the trusts. Parker had even claimed that Roosevelt's campaign manager had used his former position as head of the new Bureau of Corporations to shake companies down for donations, a lie that Parker embarrassingly retracted when Roosevelt challenged him to provide evidence. But now, the first telegrams begin to come in. It's a historic landslide, and by 9 p.m., Parker concedes. For the first time, the American people have chosen Roosevelt as their leader, and they've given him a mandate to go after the trusts. Thanks so much to Brilliant for helping us present today's historic tale. The election of 1904 was, up until that time, one of the most decisive in American history. Roosevelt won the Electoral College 336 to 140 and captured 18.8% more of the popular vote than Parker, the highest popular vote margin since 1820 when Martin Van Buren ran unopposed. The only thing that hurt him was the issue of campaign contributions. Parker had pointed out that Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and other magnates had made enormous donations to Roosevelt's political campaign, implying that he had been bought out by Standard. In fact, the attack was so worrying, Roosevelt's campaign manager had even tried to get the president to decline the corporate donations and rely instead on small individual contributions from supporters. But rather than seeing money in politics as a systematic problem that needed fixing, Roosevelt interpreted the attack a slight against his honor. He preferred to keep the contributions as a way to show that no matter if Rockefeller gave $100,000 to his campaign, he was still going to pursue Standard. He felt that turning away the donations would be a signal that he'd done something wrong. And now that he'd won, he'd prove how wrong Parker had been. Armed with the Sherman Antitrust Act, his new Bureau of Corporations, a progressive press stoking outrage against monopolies, and a huge popular mandate, Roosevelt was finally in position to do battle against trust abuses, just in time for an opportunity to fall right into his lap. Oil drilling had been going on in Kansas since 1860, but output was low until an independent driller hit a gusher in 1892. It was the first strike in what's now known as the Mid-Continent Field, an oil deposit eventually determined to stretch from Kansas through Oklahoma to Texas and Louisiana. Independent producers rushed in to drill, followed by Standard Oil. At first, the independents were actually happy for Standard to be there. It put up oil pipelines and arranged railroad systems to transport the oil out, as well as establishing refineries. But then when it controlled all of the ways to get oil out, Standard raised the transportation costs and flooded the market with cheap oil, causing independent producers that had been making over $1 a barrel to now only making around 35 cents. No one could make a profit, and they were either going out of business or headed for buyouts. So, they sounded the alarm, and Ida Tarbell showed up. To get there, she traveled by horse-drawn wagon through the worst sandstorm in decades. But when she arrived, she was greeted as something between a hero and a prophet. Hosted with parades, forced to give speeches from her hotel window, followed by reporters. It seemed she'd become the most famous woman in America. And though the crowds disturbed her writing, her celebrity meant more people approached her to tell their stories. And those stories were familiar. It seems Standard Oil was following the same playbook they'd used during the Pennsylvania oil wars of her youth, using secret railroad rebates and price fixing to drive competitors out, playing favorites on pipeline rates, bribing legislators to sink or blunt proposed antitrust laws, even tampering with juries. But as she wrote her article, she got a visit from James R. Garfield, the son of the former president and the current commissioner of the Bureau of Corporations. It seemed he was going down to Kansas himself to look into Standard's practices and was using Tarbell's notes as a guide. He verified every point she made, and then went back to Washington to help craft a two-pronged legal offensive against Standard. The first case would be based on the illegal rebates Standard had received, while the other would be a Sherman Antitrust Act suit, claiming the company was an illegal monopoly acting in restraint of trade. The illegal rebates case was the easiest to prosecute. It began in March 1907, when the government formally charged Standard Oil of Indiana with 1,903 violations of the ELKINS Act. the railroad rates law Roosevelt had pushed through in 1903. There's a fun numerical coincidence. The jury found Standard guilty on all of those counts, and the judge issued a subpoena to Rockefeller, compelling him to testify about Standard's operations in order to assess the size of the penalty. U.S. Marshals fanned out from Chicago, visiting every residence Rockefeller owned. But Rockefeller had defied subpoenas before. When state courts investigating Standard served him in the past, he exploited their limited power by simply never going in person to that state. Yet the U.S. Marshals were unrelenting, trying to slip past his armed Pinkerton guards and causing him to move from house to house in secrecy. It couldn't last. July 6, 1907, Chicago. There's a crowd outside the courthouse, yelling at Rockefeller as his guards muscle their way through. The game is up, it seems. He's too old to keep running, so he's come here to testify. But with a strategy. On the stand, as the judge questions him, Rockefeller plays a semi-senile old man. He flubs basic facts, claims not to be able to remember events or details from just a few years earlier, and repeats over and over that he'd stepped back from managing Standard over a decade ago. In one way, it works. John D. Rockefeller will not be going to prison. But in another way, it definitely doesn't. Because the judge decides to levy the maximum fine on every single rebated rail car, all 1,903 of them fining Standard Oil of Indiana, a whopping $29,240,000. It drew a gasp in the courtroom. The fine was by far the largest ever levied on an American corporation to that date. Granted, it would be appealed the next year, and a different judge eventually reversed it on a technicality. But just the fact that a judge had actually ruled against the trust, and ruled hard in more ways than one, encouraged prosecutors that they could now win in this arena. And the hits kept coming. In 1908, newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst read out a series of letters he'd obtained, where the vice president of Standard, John Archbold, sent multiple $15,000 checks to a senator and discussed antitrust legislation. Not a good look. Meanwhile, the Justice Department prepared its second case against Standard. It took years and 20,000 pages worth of supporting documents, but in 1909, the U.S. government sued Standard of New Jersey, the parent company of Rockefeller's empire. The Justice Department claimed that Standard was an illegal monopoly that used anti-competitive means like rebates, price fixing, undercutting, secretly operating companies claiming to be independent, and espionage against competitors to restrain trade. The U.S. government won. And when Standard appealed to the Supreme Court, the U.S. government won again in an 8-1 decision, with the one dissenter essentially saying the decision didn't go far enough. The judgment meant that Standard Oil would be broken up into 34 companies. Rockefeller got the news of the breakup by telegram while he was on the golf course with a priest. It wasn't a surprise by then, and Standard had been preparing a game plan. Rockefeller turned to the priest and said, "If you have any money, buy stock in Standard Oil." Then he went on to shoot the best golf game of his life. And Rockefeller was right. As the breakup happened, forming 34 baby Standards, the company's stock went through the roof. And Rockefeller personally owned 25% of Standard. It quadrupled his wealth, making Rockefeller the first ever billionaire and probably at the time, the richest man on earth. And the Standard of yesterday became the companies we all know today. Standard of New Jersey became Esso, and after another merger, Exxon. Standard of New York became Mobil, Standard of California became Chevron, and Standard of Indiana became Amoco. Now, it's debatable whether this actually fostered the competition that the government and court contended, because though separate, the companies still maintained an old boys network, and generally tried to carve up the country and stay out of each other's way. And in recent years, some like ExxonMobil have even begun to recombine, though none have the power or reach Standard did in its heyday. But though it was arguably an incomplete victory, a victory it was, and not the last. Because when Roosevelt first saw that landmark $29 million fine overturned by the courts, he realized the judicial branch could not take on the trusts alone. After all, Rockefeller and his ilk could always hire the best lawyers. No, to strike the trusts where it hurts, he would need legislation. And he knew exactly who he needed to target. The ones at the center of the illegal rebates. The railroads. Choo-choo. And whether you're riding that train to tackle large problems like busting trusts, or you're just someone who enjoys solving logic challenges, you'll find a ton of value in today's sponsor, Brilliant. They're a math and science enrichment center that focuses on STEM learning in interactive and fun ways. But don't let the good times fool you. They offer some serious high-level learning that can help you for a lifetime. In fact, while trying to decide what our actual favorite thing about Brilliant is, we had a hard time deciding between their phenomenal courses, where you can learn something new, and their super interesting quizzes that can sharpen your already acquired knowledge. So hey, we told you about both. While Jeff has been using Brilliant to brush up on his Python scripting skills, which is great for video game developers, by the way, I've been trying my hand at their casino probability quizzes because I want to better understand exactly why it is I always lose at blackjack and how I can get better. So you hear that, Vegas? I'm coming for you. Sorry. But in all seriousness, in today's tech-centric world, continuing your education is a vital part of staying on top of your game, which is why we're so excited that Brilliant not only allows you to head over to brilliant.org/extra credits to try their mind-sharpening services for free, but they're also giving the first 200 people who go to that link 20% off an annual premium subscription. So you'll be saving money buffing your brain while helping out our channel in the process. That's right, Zoe. Talk about smart. A big extra credits thanks to Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Gunnar Clovis, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reels1 for their continued legendary patronage.